And in 1973, with the war, even though Israel sort of officially won the war, there was such a downfall, such a dispiriting, disheartening response to the war, that Israel began to change. Also, what happened in 1967, because I happened to live in the country at that time, right? And three interesting things happened. Ben Gurion died, right? Golda died, and Sadat showed up. So you had the two founders of the state, Ben Gurion and Golda, passed away. And with the arrival of Sadat and the peace agreement that came the year later, the whole sort of landscape of Israel changed. Now, the important part was what happened internally. What happened internally is that up until 1977, Israel was ruled, and ruled in every sense of the word, ruled politically in the government, ruled culturally, ruled its music, its art, its ethos. Come in, I'm so glad you're here. Can I give you a hug? I know you're not hungry, but yeah. Come sit, there's a really comfortable chair right here.
Wait, I want my bag.
Okay, we'll find your bag. Okay.
Where's that bag I came with?
Alana has it. It's around your neck. This bag?
No, not that bag.
Oh, okay.
Book bag.
We'll find your book bag. Book bag?
What?
Her book bag?
Wait a minute.
Okay. Until 1977, we'll find it for you. Israel was dominated by the Eastern European and Central European Jews who founded cultural political Zionism. That is, everybody even Begin, for example, who takes over in 1977, is a Russian Jew. In other words, everybody speaks Yiddish or German. Everyone eats gefilte fish, right? But by 1977, the majority of the population was not Eastern European. By 1977, the majority of the population was what's called Mizrahi, Jews who came from Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Iraq, Iran, from the East, Jews from the East. In 1977, with the rise of Begin, Menachem Begin as a prime minister, that group began to get recognition that it had never gotten before. We'll be right here, yeah. And that kind of recognition was significant because not only did they find a voice in government and begin to get some of the political power that they needed in order to take a place in the society, they began to find their voice culturally. They began to find their voice in terms of the culture of Israel. So if you go to Israel today, which I hope you will, and you turn on the radio, and you listen to any of the Israeli stations, the popular music stations, most of the music that's being played today is sort of neo-Mizrahi music. It's music in the Arabic tone, but it's done in Hebrew, and it's neo because it also has certain influences from rock and roll and from rap music. But neo-Mizrahi music is the most popular music in Israel. And the artists, we'll learn today about the literature, in politics. So the country's become culturally much more mixed. It's restaurants, another thing you should go visit, okay? When I went to Israel as a student in 1973, there was one nice restaurant in the whole country. It was in Mishkanot Shananim, and everything else was just bland Polish food. If you're a bland Polish Jew, I apologize, but it was bland Polish food. There was one nice restaurant in the whole country, and if your mom and dad came to visit you at the Hebrew University, and everybody's mom and dad came sometime, you all went out to Mishkanot Shananim. That was the nice restaurant that they took you out, and you had a piece of duck or something like that, kosher duck, which I'd never had before. Who knew that you could eat a kosher duck, right? Now, if you go to Israel, I don't know how many of you have been, it's a foodie paradise. In fact, somebody told me that when I take tours, I go for these big philosophical tours and political tours, but somebody said we should do no politics, just food. Food, wine, and chocolate. How's that for a trip to Israel? They'll say, did you go to the wall? Did you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls? Did you go? Nah, we ate food, wine, and chocolate. That would be machaya. But it's because what happened is that the influences of the East, Mizrahi restaurant, Mizrahi food, became part of the culture of the country. And instead of just having bland Polish food, you now have spicy Mizrahi food. Right? The nicest restaurant, last year we went in Jerusalem, and it happened to be that the first day we landed was our anniversary. And I took Nina out to a restaurant, It turned out, by quite coincidence, happened to be our landlord's restaurant. It's a place called Darna in Jerusalem, which is a Moroccan restaurant. And the guy who owns it was my landlord. And he cooks the recipes from his Moroccan mother. And so he comes and he sits down and you say, like, I don't know anything on the menu. He says, it's okay, how hungry are you? You know, on a scale of 1 to 10. You say 8. He says, okay, sit back, have a nice meal. And he brings you course after course of these foods that, if you're a bland, you know, Litvak like me, you've never eaten anything like this, right? Just beautiful, wonderful Mizrahi food, and that really is what's happened in Israel. Okay, you ready? Are you doing okay? Before Miriam, she slept on the freeway so long. So a couple of announcements, and then we'll start our talk. Okay, announcement number 1. So tonight, well, I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. Next week will be our closing session, and we're going to talk about tomorrow's Zionism. And we're going to split the session in half. It's going to be a super session. So the first half is going to be Sivan Zakai, Dr. Sivan Zakai, who is the leading Israel educator in Los Angeles. And she's going to talk to us about how do you teach a young generation of American Jews all about Israel. Then the second hour, we're going to take a coffee break, we'll come back, and our guest will be Rabbi Aaron Lerner, who's the director of UCLA Hillel, and a small group of the UCLA Hillel students who are going to talk to us about 2 things. 1, what it means to represent Israel on a college campus and how hard that is. And number 2 is their kind of Zionism, how they understand Israel and how they see Zionism, which I'm going to warn you now is going to be very different than the way you see Israel and Zionism, because they were born after 1982. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon, the first sort of war that was not a response to an invasion. And it changed the culture of Israel. And these kids are born not only they're born after 1990. I mean, these kids are really young. And they see Israel in a very different way than us oldsters, okay? And that'll be next week's conversation, okay? A couple of other quick announcements. This Friday night is Rimonim. Rimonim is our monthly musical service. It starts at 6:30. Bring kids. It's a wonderful service, and you'll enjoy it very, very much. Shabbos morning, of course, is Torah study. Next weekend, February 24th and 25th, we are celebrating our cantors. We happen to have 2 marvelous cantors here at VBS, Herschel Fox and Phil Barron, and we're going to celebrate both of them, celebrate Herschel's semi-retirement and Phil's semi-advancement. And we're bringing, in the Jewish world, when you want to celebrate somebody, you bring a bigger Jew. So we had to go find a bigger chazan. The biggest chazan we could find, in every sense of the word, is Cantor Alberto Mizrahi. If it's I'll just give you this, don't turn this on the camera, but if it's Kiddush, don't stand close to him, because he may mistake and eat you instead of the lasagna. Abe Mizrahi is a marvelous, marvelous cantor. He's the cantor at Anshe Emet in Chicago. He's the president of the Cantors Assembly nationwide. And he happens to be a wonderful soul, a deeply wonderful soul. His father was a survivor of the Holocaust from Greece. And Mizrahi is not only a great cantor, he's also a great scholar of Jewish music. So we're going to get to learn with him, sing with him, and celebrate with him next weekend, okay? Friday night, that's not this Shabbos, next Shabbos. Friday night, there'll be a late Friday night service beginning at 7:30 here, and he's going to sing for us some of the great music of the cantorial tradition. Where? Here at the synagogue, I meant, right. Shabbos morning, he'll teach us, he'll daven with us, and then afterwards we can have a conversation with him, which is wonderful. So next Shabbos, come here. If you have friends who love music, any kind of music, he's a marvelous musician and a great scholar of Jewish music, and it's and a great soul. He's a really, really sweet soul, and it's a chance to be with a great Jew, great soul, and great to say thank you to our cantors. Okay, so far so good. Good. Let's begin. Everyone, stand up. Put this sheet on the chair. Turn around to the people next to you and say, "Good evening, welcome. I'm so glad you're here."
Good evening, welcome. Thank God I made it here. An hour and a half. An hour and a half. Every road was blocked. Well, lucky I left at 5:30.
Nice audience, nice
lucky I
people.
left at 5:30.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
teach as long as you want.
Okay.
Then I give them a coffee break, because we're all old Jews who need to go pish. And there's coffee. And then at the second half, we can do one of 2 things. Either I could interview you, ask you a few questions. You can answer their questions. Or if you want to take one of the texts and continue and read a little deeper into a text, we can do that too.
Let's play it by ear.
There,
See what
perfect. Good. And if
yeah.
you're tired, you don't have to go. Don't sit down, stand up. Be a strong Jew. Put your arms around each other. We make a bracha for the chance to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddishanu mitzvotav et tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. According to the Jewish tradition, one of the functions of a rabbi is to deliver tochecha, which is the rabbinic word, the biblical word for yelling at you. So hold on to your seat. I'm about to yell at you, okay? Not you, just generally you. It's also good for a rabbi to get it off his chest. In the American Jewish community, support for Israel is considered one of the principles of our identity. I'll tell you why. You can stand up in any shul, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, stand up in the middle of Shabbos services, stand up in the middle of Yom Kippur, and declare in a loud voice, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the truth of Torah, you don't believe in the efficacy of prayer, nothing will happen to you. Except the little old lady sitting behind you will ask you to move over. She wants to see the bar mitzvah. But if you stand up in pretty much any synagogue in America and say, you don't believe in the state of Israel as a Jewish state, they will kill you before you reach the exit. Because Israel has become one of the principles of our identity. Now here's my kvetch. You ready? Supporting Israel. That doesn't mean living there. David Ben-Gurion, the great prime minister, discovered this on one of his first trips to Israel because he came to the American Zionist Congress, the American Zionist movement, and he said, okay, we have a country, now come. And they told him, no, we like it here in New York. Being a diaspora Zionist. And so slowly Israeli leaders got used to this idea of the diaspora Zionists. But that's not what I'm yelling at you about, because I'm a diaspora Zionist. Here's what I'm yelling at you about. So you support Israel. Have you been? Don't say yes. Some of you have. What percentage of American Jews have been? 25%. What percentage of American Jews have been to Hawaii? More than 25%. Now, this is interesting. What do you mean you support Israel, but you've never gone? That's fetch number one, okay? You got to go. It's a place. It's a real place. It's not just an idea anymore. It used to be that when you said L'Shana Ba B'Yerushalayim at the end of Yom Kippur, the end of Pesach, it was taka, an idea, because you lived in Poland and you couldn't go anywhere. But you live here in California. You go to LAX. The flight leaves at 10:30 in the morning, and it arrives in Tel Aviv, in Lod Airport, the Ben Gurion Airport, at 10:30 the next morning. It's a direct flight. And El Al is not a bad airline anymore. It used to be, but now it's not a bad airline. Well, look, compared to Air Singapore, it's not a bad airline. No, you know the rule, by the way, is the more anti-Semitic the country, the better the airline, right? Air Emirates, great airline, right? American Airlines, so-so. Anyway, so number one, going to Israel. Here's the second part. All right, so I understand that you can't go. It's hard to leave work. It's hard to leave home. It's expensive. Okay. Do you read Hebrew? Most American Jews don't. Now, when I mean read Hebrew, I don't mean sound out letters in the prayer book. That's not reading a language. Whoever taught us that phonetic language without understanding what we're reading is reading? That's silly. But the question is, why can't we read Hebrew? If we support Israel, why don't we understand its language? How can you possibly begin to understand a culture if you can't read its newspapers and its literature, and you can't listen to its music? Now, I'm going to even let you off the hook on this one, because Miriam's going to show this. Most of the great Israeli literature has been translated. But even that, American Jews don't read. So here's my biggest fetch. What does it mean to say I support Israel if you don't participate in its culture? Israel, believe it or not, has a beautiful internal culture. It's different from what we're used to. That is, it's not the same as American Jewish culture. It's not the same as the Eastern European Jewish culture that I was raised in. It's its own kind of thing. It has its own internal language, its own way of looking at the world, its own values, its own deep experiences, its touchstone experiences. If we're going to say we support Israel, we have to participate in that kind of life. We have to get into the inner life of Israel. So tonight, I brought you a great tour guide. In fact, I think the best. So Miriam taught Jewish literature, Hebrew literature, Israeli literature at the American Jewish University for 2,000 years. How many years was it that you
That's why I finally retired.
I know. You finally read, and she finally...
In 2000, I said, that's it, 28.
28 years, and she finally retired. And when she retired, we said, we're not letting you go. We're going to keep bugging you to come and teach. She's been here many times before because she's a wonderful guide to the inner life of Israel. And the inner life of Israel. I'll tell you how good a guide she is. Is your cookbook here? Did you bring the cookbook?
No, I didn't bring the cookbook.
Miriam published a cookbook, right? Based on...
It's called the Jewish Festival Cook. My sister, Phyllis Glazer, is a very well-known food personality in Israel on TV and so on.
The Martha
books.
Stewart of Israel, except she didn't go to
Except
jail.
Health food. Healthy food.
So, I mean,
And
so
we
not only
published
does
a
Miriam know
cookbook
the
together.
literature, she knows the food, right? And she's a wonderful tour guide to the inner life of Israel, which I think those of us who say we support Israel really have to enter into. This is a gateway in. So please welcome my dear, dear friend, Professor Miriam Glazer. Love you. I'm so glad you're here. Hope you're okay. I got
yeah,
water
I
for
am,
you.
okay. Yeah, I'm gonna-
These
yeah.
microphones are very odd. You have to speak directly in it, or these people will shout at you.
Really?
Well, they really will shout at you.
Can you hear me if I don't?
No, see,
Oh, you really can't?
yeah,
Oh,
you can't. The
oh,
room is set up in such a way.
okay. Oh, it's so weird. I have to.
That's good, too.
Oh, yeah, I have to hold it. I feel a real need to preface, thank you, to preface what I'm going to say by saying that as much to support Israel, to love Israel, is not to be oblivious of its issues. And I think tonight, when we probe its literature and we read, we study what the writers of Israel are dealing with, we will have to acknowledge the very difficult sides of the country that we love, as well as some of the beautiful sides. So with that introduction, I'd like to start with a little story. Many years ago, many decades ago, my sister Phyllis, the co-author with me of that cookbook, was standing outside her house in Tel Aviv, her apartment. It's really in the heart of Tel Aviv. If you've been there, it's a few blocks from where the Tel Aviv Hilton is. And she got out of her car, and the entire street was laughing. Out of every single apartment on the street, there was laughter. Everybody was watching the same television program, and it was a funny one. She finally realized it. That's why everybody's laughing. But that was a long time ago. That was when there was about one television station in Israel. The Israel that has emerged since those days is a much more cacophonous place. It's not only doesn't it just have one television station, it has a multiplicity of stations as we do. Stations from all over the world, as well as produced in Israel. The sense of the collectivity that once existed, the communal experience that once existed, no longer exists. It's not so different in some ways from the fact that years and years ago, we all watched Walter Cronkite to find out what the news was. And today, that lands, there is no Walter Cronkite, no equivalent to a Walter Cronkite. Yes. Right. I'd like to read you a few pages of my book on Israeli women writers. I'd take you on a bit of a journey back to what was. This is this is before, this is the speech that Rabin gave, declaring that Israel was no longer going to be a country that dwelled alone. It was July 13th. The newly elected Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signaled a radical shift in Israel's official self-apprehension and stance toward the world by drawing on the biblically resonant words of the pre-state poet Rachel, quote, "A concerted, stubborn, and eternal effort of 1,000 hands, will it succeed in rolling the stone from off the mouth of the well? The answer is within us," said Rabin. "The answer is in us ourselves. No longer are we a nation that dwells alone, and no longer is it true that the whole world is against us. We must overcome the sense of isolation that has held us in its thrall for almost half a century." And even as the country was sorely split between those who celebrated and those who bitterly bewailed our labor's victory, just over the Green Line, the 56th month of the Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, was raging. That July in Gaza, Bethlehem, Hebron, and villages and refugee camps throughout the West Bank, there were Molotov cocktails, tear gas, and rubber bullets, curfews, raids, injuries, deaths. By the 56th month of the Intifada, more than 1,000 Palestinians had been killed. Oh, the miraculous Holy Land. Oh, the land of hardship and gallows, wrote the poet Maya Bejarano. For the kind of wrenching disparity so inescapably vivid that summer of Rabin's speech were no aberrations for Israel. From the earliest days to the moment I was writing this, the country has been a bevy of contradictions, controversies, paradoxes. Disjunctions and disparities have flowed through its arteries. They seem to exist in its very heart. A former military hero, Rabin, tries to inspire a revisioning of his country's self-perception by drawing on words of a woman poet who for decades had been depicted as producing only personal lyrics. Operation Solomon heroically rescues thousands of Ethiopian Jews from starvation, suffering, and discrimination, only to have hundreds discover upon their arrival in Israel that the religious authorities were not willing to consider them Jews. Jerusalem Shelamata, Jerusalem of the earth. Jerusalem of the earth is simultaneously the site of serene spirituality and interreligious squabbles, displaced neighborhoods, and violently contested heaps of stones. A capital city with volatile subcultures, remote from the tenors of Haifa, Tel Aviv, or Beersheba, and all four from those of the villages in the Galilee, the scattered agricultural settlements, or the dusty towns of the Negev. Israel is at once first world in its dominant ideologies and economic ranking, and third world in its preponderance of its people's ethnicities. It is at one time both the East and the West. It's a Mediterranean country the size of Rhode Island, with a population smaller than ours in Los Angeles County, that is. It repeatedly garners world headlines. It's a vividly robust country of artistic sophistication, technological brilliance, and military might, of serious poverty and great wealth, spiritual questing, fierce secularism alongside religious and political fanaticism, brutality, ethnic, religious, and racial discrimination, suicide bombs, despair, closures, arrests, and alongside its immense vitality, there are deaths constantly in too many and too frequent traffic accidents, in exchanges on the borders, in bus explosions, in suicide bombings in the open-air market and the shopping promenade in downtown Jerusalem, in a major mall and popular cafe in Tel Aviv. War insinuates itself in every pore, said Maya Bejarano, as Israelis huddled behind gas masks and unimpeded by, quote, so-called secure borders, Iraqi missiles exploded on the city streets. That was Israel in 2000. That was the Israel of contradictions. So many forces have conflated to erase any traces of the kind of collectivity that Phyllis experienced that day on the street in Tel Aviv. But even that collectivity was in some way an illusion. Since I wrote those words in my book, the war has continued to insinuate itself in every pore. The wars in Lebanon, the wars in Gaza, the intifadas, the suicide attacks, the invasions and attacks by Israelis. In the 20 years since Rabin was killed, Israel has grown, as one critic wrote, more religious, more conservative, and more messianic. 400,000 settlers are now in what was once Palestinian territory. In 1996, when Yigal Amir, the assassin, took Rabin's life and asked for whiskey to toast his death afterwards, when he was convicted, 10% of Israelis thought he should be released. In 2006, 30% did. Economically, too, Israel has changed. It's recognized as the world's second most innovative economy, a country the size of Rhode Island. It's a brilliant wellspring of technological and medical innovations that have transformed lives for the better all over the world and have been adopted. Israel is called the startup nation. But it's also the place where the child poverty rate has zoomed up to 55% under the present government. And 1/3 of Israel's children now live below the poverty line. I could not understand how an entire nation like mine, an enlightened nation by all accounts, is able to train itself to live as a conqueror without making its own life wretched, David Grossman wrote in his riveting nonfiction book, The Yellow Wind. And he said, what happened to us? Writing is a political act, says Israeli writer Ayelet Gundar Goshen. She says, quote, I think Israel is a very political country. We are in the middle of a huge conflict zone, and we have 2,000 years of history of very difficult politics. I don't think it is possible to write anything in Israel without referring to politics. If you were to decide to write something that didn't refer to politics, then that itself is a political decision. I don't mean to say that fiction has to limit itself to the current conflict. Writing itself is a political act, but it's much wider than everyday politics. It's a political act because it deals with morals, with people, with power, and with knowledge. Literature is a humanistic act. When you're writing a novel, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other. Once you try to write from a different perspective, you cannot remain blind to the needs of other people or other nations. In other words, it's the gift of writing from many perspectives and the brilliance of doing so that we are going to look at tonight. My first book. The first book that we're going to look at is the perspective of a fascinating writer. Her name is Ronit Matalon. Her work has been translated into 6. The only books we're dealing with tonight, by the way, are ones that have been translated into English, so that I wanted them to be available to, so if I talk about them and you get interested, you can actually read it if you don't read Hebrew. There are more books on your list than I'm going to talk about tonight, because if I talked about all the books on the list, tomorrow morning we could have breakfast together. So Ronit Matalon's work has been translated into 6 languages, and she's won awards in both Israel and in France. Matalon is a professor of comparative literature at the University of Haifa, and also a professor of screenwriting at a film college. She covered Gaza and the West Bank from 1986 to 1993 for Haaretz. Matalon writes about one of the themes that I've been talking about, and that's the complexity of multiple identities. She herself is the daughter of a family, an immigrant family from Egypt, the only child in her family that was born in Israel to her French and Arabic-speaking parents. How many of you have heard of the Mabarot? Yes, you were in one? Why? Okay. Okay. What you want to tell everyone what the Mabarot were?
It's a settlement place where new immigrants came to, and when we got there, we stayed in a tent for over a month, and then we stayed in our huts. They were building them at high speed.
That's right.
Wooden huts, and we stayed. It was pretty rough. I mean, but we were all very happy because we were in Israel, and we had this enormous feeling that we had come home. And my mother was a terrific Zionist.
From where?
Was a rabbi. We went from Shanghai and Hong Kong.
Ah.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Thank you. For the Matalon family, however, it was different because many of the Jews who lived in Egypt, in Cairo, loved their lives in Cairo. They were quite happy there. They were French and Arabic speaking. They had a rich culture of their own. They were politically active. And suddenly, because of the declaration of the state and the rise of Nasser, they had to get out. And so many of them were sad about leaving. They were forced into becoming refugees, as did many of the Jews from the Arab world. In Cairo, her family were aristocrats, they were educated, but then they came to Israel with nothing. Her father, in despair, abandoned the family even before she was born. He wasn't willing to live in Israel, he said, as an Oriental Jew who was being marginalized by the Ashkenazis who governed the country and dominated its economic and social life then. Her mother, who came from a wealthy Cairo family, but arrived in Israel with nothing, became a cleaning woman for as many as 12 hours a day to provide for her 3 children and her own mother. In fact, that happened to the Russians, some of the Russians who came more recently as well. They had positions of prestige in Russia, and when they got to Israel, they realized their qualifications were completely outdated. They couldn't get work, and they landed up cleaning the streets or becoming cleaning women. I thought I would read you an excerpt from the book. It's poetic, it's moving, and it's a very, very different kind of book because it consists of short little excerpts, images that are picked up along the way by different people. So it's impressionistic, it's full of feeling, it's full of imagery, rather than having a linear plot. You know what I mean, a beginning, middle, and end plot that rises, becomes very dramatic and then comes to a resolution. This is her description of her mother's hands. Nona is her grandmother. Her hands were those of a laborer. Nona said, "A man's hands. Look at the hands she's got, just like a man." Nona's own hands were so perfect. They had attained the status of an ideal, white as white could be, almost unblemished, as if they had been dipped in flour. The hauteur of her fingers, transcending the very idea of refinement, was breathtaking. I felt for Nona's hands constantly, as if I were seeking confirmation of something. Hands, what they were and could be, were a hard, bitter stone stuck in the throat of their dreadful quarrels, the quarrels between her mother and her grandmother. The mutual insults, the symbolic and once even real slashing of veins, the harassment, the silence that went on for days and sometimes weeks. Nona said, "I left the real sweet Lucette," her mother's name in Egypt, "behind in Egypt. First she said, she's got the hands of a man, and only afterwards, the real Lucette stayed in Egypt." Who was the real Lucette? Nona remembered her, or thought she did. That mouth she's got on her, that tongue of hers, she never had that before. Nothing like that. Opening that mouth of hers like she does now, she learned that over here. Like a doll she was, pretty as a doll with honey on her tongue. Never mind what she said, only honey on her tongue. Yes, mother, no, mother, certainly, mother, only honey. And her cheeks, her skin, there was nothing like Lucette's skin. These words in Nona's mouth, repeated again and again, tasted like the snitching of an informer, informing on the good, not the bad. She betrayed the good Lucette, the grace she once had, because the good one was in hiding. Something great, the loss of which was nothing short of catastrophic, had fled from sight during their emigration. Femininity had been sacrificed to this rough place, to its new, rough, male humanity. At the heart of this femininity were the hands, and more the care of them as a womanly asset, at once manifest and mysterious. For the lack of their care, Nona blamed my mother, perhaps more than for the fact of having a man's hands. That was it, that they hadn't been a man's hands at first, not at first. Nona might have resigned herself to a grace not granted, but not to a grace given and then ruined again and again. It's as if she does it on purpose, that stubborn mother of yours, on purpose. And of course, no sooner does she arrive in Israel than they say, Lucette, that's not a Hebrew name. Your name is Levana. And not only she changes her sense of herself, her life changes, her role changes. All through the book, we get a sense of what the immigration was like for people who lost everything. And especially not for those who came from Europe, but those who came from the Mizrahi countries. And I think that's really important for us, as I assume nearly 99% of the people in this room, if not everyone, is an Ashkenazi Jew, or chetzi, or lo chetzi, or Mizrahi. That experience, as we as Westerners are not really familiar and with the experience of those who came from a very different culture, from the culture of Russia and the culture of Poland and the culture of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And it's those Mizrahim who suffered greatly in the early years of the state because the leadership was Ashkenazi, and the leadership did not particularly respect these Jews from the Eastern world. It's only now that we say, I think you mentioned how the Mizrahi culture has influenced the food, has influenced the music. It's only now that the Mizrahi side of Israeli culture is really coming to fruition and flowering. And one of the reasons is because of writers like Ronit Matalon. I urge you, if you know nothing about that culture, or if you want to read something sensitive and probing and moving and quite female, I urge you to take a look at that book. You can see I have some passages, little passages here that Israel is a culture made up of many, many cultures. One of those cultures is the culture of the Israeli Arab, or the Palestinian Arab, as distinct from the Arabs on the West Bank. One of the greatest writer from that community is a man by the name of Sayed Kashua. How many of you have heard of him? Those are my students who are assigned to read this book for our next class. Lucky you've heard of him. Okay. Sayed Kashua is a fascinating writer. He came from the Palestinian Arab village called Tira, and was a brilliant young man, landed up going to a boarding school with Jews. He was like one of the only Arabs there. He became a writer for Haaretz. How many of you happen to watch the program Arab Labor? Yes, Arab Labor was his creation, right? It was a series, a very funny, poignant series on Israeli television, and then was shown on American television. I don't remember whether they dubbed it or they were just, no, they didn't dub it. Yeah. If you ever get a chance, it tells you so much about the country in a sort of touching, funny, touching, kind of revelatory way. It's based on the phrase avodah aravit, which in Hebrew is a put down. Arab work was the way you dismiss, if work wasn't done well, your floors weren't laid well, or your electricity wasn't put in well, it would be dismissed as, well, that's Arab labor. So there's a double meaning That's Arab work, you know. There's a double meaning to that title. He was a writer for Haaretz, author of several books, and a very brilliant book, very moving and deeply disturbing novel called A Second Person Singular. Now, even after I finished the book, I asked myself, what does that title mean? I'm giving away part of our class, okay? What does that title mean? Who knows Hebrew? How would you translate that into Hebrew? Second person singular. Second person is you, right? So, but how would you say that phrase in Hebrew? How do you say second person? Guf sheni yachid. Guf sheni yachid. But what does that, the guf sheni, what does that imply? It's not only, but when we hear second person singular, what do you think of? Grammar, right? We're talking grammar. We're talking about the word, what is you, right? When you say guf sheni yachid, however, what does it imply? No. Guf sheni, grammatically. I mean, literally, what does it mean? Guf sheni. Just guf sheni, what does it mean? What? Second body. The second body, singular, alone. And that's what the story's about. It's the strangest story imaginable. It is the story of a young Arab boy who, I'll just skim the surface of it, who lands up to earn some money working with a young, paralyzed Israeli Jewish boy. He's completely paralyzed. He's not conscious. He's in a coma. He's not conscious. And it's the result of the young, beautiful young Israeli boy having tried to commit suicide. And this young Arab boy is working to change. He's at home. He's in his mother's home. She won't let him go. She keeps him alive, even though he's in this coma. And he lands up taking on this young Israeli boy's identity. He's the second person in the same, it's the second body, the same person. Okay, you understand what I mean? He becomes Yonatan. The boy's name is Yonatan. And he, with the mother's support, in order to survive in Israel, in order to overcome the discriminations and self-hate and internalize self-hatred and of the Israeli Arab, he realizes that the only way to be at peace in this country is to be a Jew. So he becomes Yonatan. He's the Guf Sheni he's the second body who is that one person, Yonatan. So here, I'd like to read you a little excerpt from this. Which is the one that I wanted to, oh, here. What the book deals with, actually, let me say a little more. What the book deals with so movingly is the issues within the Arab-Israeli culture and the issues within the Jewish culture. It's dealing with both at the same time. It's talking about the desperation of the middle-class Arab the Arab bourgeoisie to overcome the fact that they feel like second-class citizens by becoming obsessively materialistic, showing off their big cars, showing off their big houses, and hiding from the fact that they feel that nothing that they will do will ever make them equal to Jews in the state. At the same time as they want nothing to do, and they look down on the West Bank Arabs. They want nothing to do with the people we call Palestinians. They look down on them. They see them as inferior. Plus, they resent the fact that the collaborators are getting killed and dumped, either getting killed and dumped in their villages, or just being sent to live in Arab villages. They look down on those collaborators as well. Yuck. So the Arab-Israeli culture is full of contradictions, full of issues, so much so that the main Arab character, other than this boy Amir who becomes Yonatan, is someone known only as the lawyer. He has no name. All through the book, he has no name. And he has no name because his only sense of self-worth resides in this important position that he sees himself occupying in the culture. So the book takes us through the pain of the mother of Yonatan, the Israeli Yonatan, who's in a coma because he tried to commit suicide. The pain of the Arab Israeli who feels displaced within the culture but wants nothing to do with, looks down on the other Palestinians who live on the West Bank. The struggle of a young boy, the son of a single mother and therefore despised by his own Arab community, this young boy to find a place of worth in Israeli culture. He becomes a photographer, studies at Bezalel, pretending that he's Yonatan. And all of the cultural dilemmas that are so alive in that country. This is one of the most brilliant books you can imagine. It is strange to read, but an easy read, and it teaches you so much. Remember that I quoted the young writer Ayelet Gander about literature being about having to get to know the other. That when you're a writer, you've got to understand everybody, not just the people like you, because you've got to get into their skin. That's what this book does. It puts us all in the skin of those whose culture we really know nothing about. And we don't even notice that they're there, the Arab Israelis. We don't recognize that they're an important part of Israeli culture as well. Just as the Mizrahim are, so are the Arab Israelis. And the tragedy of Sayed Kashua is that he couldn't stand the contradictions of being an Arab Israeli anymore. He couldn't take it, and after his children were discovered how much, after he discovered how much his own children were suffering, he took a position at the University of Illinois, and then teaching, of course, Hebrew. And Israeli literature. And he continued to write for Haaretz, and then he decided that he couldn't bring his children back to Israel. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be a sabbatical. And then he decided to stay. And he wrote this letter. And then he decided to stay, and he committed himself to staying in Illinois, But then he wrote a letter to another up-and-coming, famous Israeli writer named Etgar Keret, about whom I will tell you in a moment. And this is the letter he wrote. Dear Etgar, I, who was so happy that I left, that I took my family far away from that terrible place called Israel, that I removed them from the smell of gunpowder and blood. I sometimes feel that I'm the most miserable of all of us. I'm afraid to stay here in Illinois, and I'm so afraid of the day I have to go home to Jerusalem, to Israel. Leaving was traumatic. I felt like a refugee running for his life, and the decision to leave quickly was made even before the war with Gaza began. On the day the Palestinian boy was burned to death in Jerusalem, I realized that I couldn't let my kids leave the house anymore. That day, I called the travel agent and asked her to get us out as soon as possible. Unfortunately, it took a few days, and that damn war, another damn war, had already started. And the racism that I'd seen around the Second Intifada at the end of 2000 was reaching terrifying heights. I was so afraid, and I felt really persecuted. You know, I was at the zenith of my success with a film scheduled to come out this summer and a new series being shot during those first days of the war. And all of a sudden, I felt like I'd been turned into the enemy. All of a sudden, every runny-nosed journalist thinks they can vent their anger on me. All of a sudden, I'm afraid of the water girl on the set. All of a sudden, even the production assistant I never met thinks he can stand in front of me when I come for the day's shooting and tell me with a clear sense of superiority, we have to bomb the hell out of them one by one. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid of my kind-hearted next-door neighbors because they have a look in their eyes that I never saw before the war. I'm afraid of the barman who's been pouring me beers for more than 20 years. And this is what Etgar Keret writes back. Hi, Saeed. I was really happy to get a letter from you and really sad when I read it. I hate to say it, but I know the Illinois town you're living in pretty well. A few years ago, when his son Lev was in kindergarten, I was invited to lecture at the University of Illinois and went there with my family for a few weeks. When we came back to Israel, each of us weighed a few kilos more, and we were all thankful that the airline charges money for overweight suitcases, but not for overweight people. That's how it is when you live in a country where instead of celebrating Yom Kippur and Holocaust Memorial Day, they celebrate Donut Day. There really is such a thing, I swear. And it's easy for me to understand why you haven't found your place there. You asked me for an optimistic story with a happy end. So here goes. I'm going to give it a try. And the story that follows is kind of typical of Etgar Keret's style. 2015 was a historic year in the Middle East, all because of a surprising, brilliant idea that an Arab-Israeli expatriate had. One evening, the writer was sitting on the front porch in Urbana, Illinois, that's where Kashua is, looking at the endless cornfields that spread all the way to the horizon. Seeing that enormous expanse, he couldn't escape the thought that maybe the troubles in the place he came from stemmed from the fact that there simply wasn't enough room for everybody. If I could just pack all those fields in my suitcase, he said to himself, fold them very, very neatly, very, very small, I could fly back to Israel with them. I'd pass through customs on the Green Line for people who have nothing to declare, because what would I really have? It wasn't as if I'd be bringing in some subversive ideology in my suitcase or anything else that would interest a customs inspector. All I would have are some huge cornfields that I folded up very, very small. And when I got home, I'd open the suitcase, take them out, and shazam! all of a sudden there would be enough land for everyone, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and even some left over for a giant amusement park where both peoples could take all the knowledge and technology that they applied to developing weapons and use them instead, turn them into a playground instead. That's not the problem, dummy, my wife said. Even if you manage, his wife said, even if you manage to squeeze all the land into the world, into that battered suitcase of yours, you'd never succeed in bringing peace to the region. On the one hand, the radical ultra-Orthodox would say that God promised all those cornfields to them. And on the other, the messianic racists would say those cornfields are their birthright. There's no getting away from it, husband, she said. We were born in a place where even though a lot of people want to live side by side in peace, there are still enough people on both sides who don't want to, and they'll never let it happen. The next day, he tried to write a story, something sad with a lot of self-pity, about an honest, good man whose life and wife had both been cruel to him for no reason. But as he labored over the story, a brilliant idea popped into his head, 100 times better than the previous one, about how to solve the problems of the Middle East. If the issue wasn't territory, but people, all they had to do was update the two-state solution to a three-state solution. The Palestinians would live in the first, the Israelis in the second, and the radical fundamentalists, the racists, and all those people who just got their kicks fighting could live in the third. Great, brilliant. In less than a decade, there were 3 countries side by side in that tiny corner of the Middle East: the state of Israel, the state of Palestine, and the Republic of Force is the only language they understand. A place where civil war raged constantly and which arms dealers and news broadcasters supported. The writer, who in the story is quite modest, politely refused the Nobel Peace Prize, packed his suitcase, and went back with his family to his old house in Israel. And each time Barack Obama came to the Middle East in another one of his unsuccessful efforts to bring peace to the Republic of Force is the only language they understand, he'd stop in for a visit to the writer who had managed with his own hands to bring peace to his people. They'd sit together in silence on the writer's balcony, which overlooked a terraced valley, and eat heartily of the ears of corn resting on the plates in front of them. Carrot says, that's the story. I'm not sure it's really a story, and I don't know if it's really optimistic, but it's the best I could do. Take care of yourself, and whatever happens, don't cut corners when it comes to coats in Iowa. A coat there is an important thing. P.S. Be careful. A common occurrence among Israelis who immigrate to the United States is that they begin speaking Yiddish. And in the case of Arabs, it might sound comical. So that's Syed Kashua and Etka Carrot. Etka Carrot has been called the founder of a generation, one of the major voices of the generation. He's funny, he writes short stories, he's one of those postmodernists that looks at life with irony, with humor, and with a certain kind of grace. The last book I want to talk about, actually it's actually it's one of the 3 last books I want to talk about. I'll try to talk more quickly. Is a brilliant book. It's called The Hilltop, and it's by a writer by the name of Asaf Gavron. What makes, as one writer said, what really makes The Hilltop ascend to the top of the literary heap is the sharp movement between 2 antithetical poles of the storytelling craft. On the one hand, you have this meticulously orchestrated voice sending the reader to all kinds of reflections on what it means to be Israeli. And then on the other, you find so much emotion, enough emotion to sort of rip the heart in two. The story is of an illegal settlement in the West Bank, and it's ironic and it's funny and it's sad about the way they set it up, about the incompetence of the authorities, the madness of the system, so that in one Israeli bureau it doesn't exist. In the other, in one department, the settlement doesn't exist. In the other department, they have to supply electricity. So because it has to be on the grid. So does it exist? Does it not exist? Is it supposed to exist? Is it not supposed to exist? And into that settlement, and the sort of funny, ironic, kind of sad at the same time madness around the establishment of this illegal settlement comes the brother of the settler leader, who's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He gets the brilliant idea, and I'll read you the idea. In the middle of a demonstration, he sees, on the West Bank, he sees an Arab selling oil. "What's all this?" Roni asked. "Olive oil, dirt cheap," the Palestinian said. "How much is dirt cheap?" 18 liters, 300 of shekels. Roni did the math in his head. A little over 15 shekels a liter, less than $4, cheap indeed. $2.50 and it's a deal. The Palestinian smiled. "No, 300 of shekels, dirt cheap," he said. So the two of them do some business, right? Ronnie gets the idea that the brilliant thing to do with this olive oil, it's organic, it's made the old way with millstones, it's from ancient olive trees, bottle it and sell it to the Tel Aviv yuppies as organic olive oil. And he's all excited. He's got a whole business to set up. And of course, it never does come to fruition. But it's a brilliant juxtaposition of the world of Tel Aviv with the world of the Arab farmer, with the world of the settlements. And it takes you through humor, through tragedy, through heartbreak, through insanity. And he captures everybody's perspective in a way that enables you to see reality through their eyes. That's an important thing for a writer to do. A book that's pure propaganda, that takes a narrow point of view, is uninteresting, nor is it good literature. But a book that enables you, if you're against the settlements, to sort of understand the settler, and if you're pro-settlements, to understand some of the limitations and contradictions of what they're doing, and to see urban Israel next to the hills of Israel, the rural hills of Israel, is a great gift. And to be able, at one point, to have your heart broken by what the two brothers suffered as children, and on the other hand, to laugh your head off at the insanity that comes to be, is a brilliant achievement and can give you insight into the country as few books can. So I very much recommend the book, The Hilltop. I'm going to skip to two other books now. This book, Amos Oz's Judas, is one of the most, it's a difficult book, as all of Amos Oz's books are. Very, very difficult. And Nicholas Delange, his translator, is one of the most brilliant translators imaginable. He does such a beautiful job. This is not an easy read, but it is so profoundly moving. And it is so challenging to your assumptions about life, about Israel, about Judaism, about Judas himself. Amos Oz, I don't know whether to let the cat out of the bag or not let the cat out of the bag. I'm kind of torn. On the one hand, I want to tell you about the book. On the other hand, I want you to read the book and not tell you too much about the book. So I don't quite know what to do right now. What do you want me to do? You want me to tell you or not tell you? How many want me to tell you? I'll tell you. Okay. All right. The book revolves around just a very few characters. A young man who's kind of been writing his PhD dissertation, which he doesn't finish, about Judas. Judas from the New Testament, Judas, who was the one who supposedly accepted the silver shekels in return for betraying Jesus. Amos Oz has said that as a young boy, he was called a traitor by others. And he also said, because he made friends with a British officer, during the time that the British were occupying pre-state Israel. He himself experienced being called a traitor, and he was always fascinated with the figure of Judas from the New Testament, because Judas was a wealthy landowner. So why would he have done anything for a mere 20 shekels of silver, which meant nothing to him? He didn't need it. He was a wealthy guy. And as a kid, Amos Oz has said that as a kid, he couldn't figure out what was behind this story. Why a wealthy landowner wouldn't have done this. So he has put forth in this book a whole new vision of who Judas was in a way that's kind of brilliant, and it sort of shakes you up and enables you to see Jesus himself in a very different way, and certainly the whole history of Christianity in a different way. But at the same time that he's dealing with this ancient supposed act of betrayal, about which I will not tell you the details, at the same time as he's dealing with that, he's dealing with other kinds of betrayal. This young man, Shmuel, moves into this house with an old man who his job is to help take care of the old man, and a woman who's a widow, whose husband was killed her husband Micha was killed in a war, in the War of Independence. But this is, let me find the. Her father was a man named Abravanel. And he was hated and dismissed, and considered, her father was considered a traitor, and sort of closed himself up in the house and saw no one, talked to no one, and so on. Why was her father considered a traitor? Well, where was it? I'm sorry. Abravanel was never impressed by nationalism at all, anywhere. He was totally unimpressed by a world divided into hundreds of nation states, like rows and rows of separate cages in a zoo. He didn't know Yiddish. He spoke Hebrew and Arabic. He spoke Ladino, English, French, Turkish, and Greek. But to all the states in the world, he applied a Yiddish expression, Goyim Nachas, Gentiles' delight. Statehood seemed to him a childish and outdated concept. So he was a naive man, a dreamer? It was Ben-Gurion who was the dreamer, not Abravanel. Ben-Gurion and the herd who followed him like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, to the slaughter, to violent expulsion, to eternal hatred between the two communities. Shmuel shifted uncomfortably in Mr. Wald's upholstered chair. The thought that all the nation states were like cages at the zoo made him want to hurl in Italia's and her father's face that if people treated each other like wild beasts, it might be necessary to keep them in cages. But he reminded himself that Italia, Abravanel's daughter, was a war widow and decided to say nothing. How could someone who did not believe in a Jewish state possibly have called himself a Zionist and even sat for years on the Zionist Executive Committee and the Council of the Jewish Agency? As if reading his mind, Italia said in a voice that blended contempt and sadness, he didn't come to that view overnight. The Arab Revolt in 1936, Hitler, the underground movements, the killings, the retaliation operations of the Jewish underground, the hangings by the British, and especially his conversations with his Arab friends, all these brought him to the view that there was in fact room for the two communities and that it would be better for them to exist side by side, or one within the other, without the framework of a state, and so on. I won't take you through any more of it, but you get the idea that this was a man who served with Ben-Gurion on the Zionist Committee, who then had a totally different idea of what the Middle East could look like, and was branded a traitor and shut himself up. And his daughter ended up losing her husband in the Independence War. So brutally, he was brutalized by the Arabs, horribly brutalized, the corpse was. This is a story that wrenches you and forces you to think. It forces you to think about what statehood is about, what morality is about, what we owe one another, what alternatives to our current ways of looking at reality might be. And it's so moving. I can't even begin to tell you. At the beginning, it's hard to get into, and it's strange. It's a strange, strange book. Whoever thinks about Judas, whoever thinks about the possibility of no state, whoever thinks about those things. But this book forces you to think about those things. And it forces you to do that in a way that is compelling and moving, intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally challenging. Every one of these books will introduce you in many, many different ways to the complexities, beauties, and challenges of one of the most creative, brilliant, and at the same time challenged, troubled countries in the world. This is not an easy literature. It's not an easy country. But no one, no multifaceted human being is all good or all bad. The richer we are as personalities, the more complex we are, the more nuances there are to our personality. And just like a person has many different aspects to them, so does a country, especially a very little country that's no bigger than Rhode Island, but has one of the richest, most complex cultures in the world and some of the most brilliant writers. I really invite you to be challenged, to have your thoughts challenged, to have your thinking challenged, and set up a little book group so that you get to discuss these books with others, because they're complicated, they're difficult. I haven't even gotten to David Grossman, but it's enough. Okay, thank you.
So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take 5 minutes conversation about this. So I want to. Good. Okay, we good? I want to reiterate the last point you made, because I think it's a terribly important point, and it's something that escapes us. The politics of Israel and the Middle East and America now are so fraught, so filled with tension, that the whole vision of the world tends to get reduced to very simplistic blacks and whites. You're pro-Israel or you're anti-Israel. You're on the right or you're on the left. You're pro-Palestinian, you're pro-Israel. The politics get very, very, very narrow, at least here in America. Now, in Israel, it's different, but in America, I find that the politics get very narrow. And one of the things that these authors are able to do, because they're writing fiction, is to encompass a world of complexity.
That's right.
Both complex ideas, complex vision, and complex emotions. As you said at the beginning in your introduction, you had a whole list of words, which I try to write down quickly because they're good sermon words. Disparities, contradictions, paradox, disjunction. I wrote a bunch more of dialectics. But that's what, and a realistic vision, if you were completely emotionless looking at Israel in the Middle East, you would see all this complexity. But because we have this sense of a steep stake in it, we tend to reduce all the complexity down to us and them. And us and them can be numbers of different groups of us's and them, but it's all us and them. But these guys have a wonderful way of capturing the complexity. And what I think is really more important even than the complexity of ideas is the complexity of emotions.
Yes.
For Etgar Keret to be able to laugh. I remember Ephraim Kishon was the first great Israeli humorist, you know? And all the things that used to drive us crazy when we were in Israel, the buses, the post office, you know.
The Jews.
The Jews, right. You know, that he was able to laugh at them, right? Right? And the cartoonist, what was the cartoonist in the Jerusalem Post, the guy, Schuldig, whatever that cartoon, and be able to laugh at, you know, even to laugh at it, right? But you know, Amos Oz and the others who are able to really explore that complexity. That seems to be what's really remarkable about Israeli literature.
Yeah, I think so.
Pull the mic real close so that they don't yell at you. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. I think one of the, I mean, I really tried quite intensely to try to get that across tonight, that the writers really delve into the inner life of the country through its people. The fears, the hopes, the tensions, the anxieties, the hope, the love, the frustration, and that to love a country, just like to love a person, is to be have a nuanced and complex view of who that person is. I mean, we accept each other, those we love, with their shortcomings, with their issues, with their neuroses, with their nuttiness, as well as with all their beautiful qualities. Why should it be different for a country that we love? You know, any simplistic view of good and evil is just that, simplistic. And just as, you know, suddenly I'm reminded of the time I caught my adorable, sweet little, then 5-year-old girl stealing candy in a store. Was I supposed to pretend she didn't steal it? Was I, you know, supposed to say, sweetie, oh, steal it, just put it in your pocket and get away, see what you can get away with. No, recently she made me a jar of things that she loved, every little pieces of paper, all these things that she loved about me, put it in a jar, and every day I'd pick one up. And one of the little pieces of paper said, "The day you made me apologize to the store owner about stealing the candy." What a nice way to handle that was. That's how we have to be towards a country as well. We have to hold it accountable. And it doesn't mean we don't love it. It means that we love it enough to hold it accountable. And just as we do America, certainly many of us hold this country accountable for the things that it does wrong, that we see it's doing wrong in the world. And we have to do it for Israel as well, I think. And the writers capture that. They capture the beauty and they capture the pain.
One of the things I think that's interesting about Israel, though, and tell me if I'm wrong, Israel's a literary society. And what I mean by that is, and America's not. If I ask you right now, quick, name a contemporary American novelist who really is important to the country. And the answer is either J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books.
And who's British.
Or the person who wrote, or the person who wrote 50 Shades of Grey.
There's
what American, you go take an American literature class, you begin with Faulkner and Fitzgerald and those guys, all right, so Philip Roth maybe, but we're not a literary society. We're
No.
a cinema society. But Israel is a deeply literary society. Just to give you two examples. So one is, Nina and I we're staying in Tel Aviv. We've fallen in love with Tel Aviv because we live in Jerusalem. We fall in love with Tel Aviv. So we were staying in Tel Aviv, and it turned out that Bialik's house is around the block from where we're staying.
Oh, I know where you
So
are.
Chaim Nachman Bialik's house happens to be on Bialik Street. I should have known, right? So we walked down the street, and we got to Bialik's house, and it was a Thursday morning where our flight was late in the day. We were walking around. No one else was there. And you walk around, and what they did was they took the house that he lived in, and he only lived there for about 10 years. He didn't live in Israel very long. But they made the house into a museum of his life, of his works, with pictures. It was just beautiful. And I'm trying to think of what American writer's house has been turned into a shrine like that. But for a country that really prizes its writers, this becomes a national landmark, the house that he lived in. And then the second thing that's amazing is, as you said several times, is Israel has as many people as there are fewer people than LA County, right? So there are, if there's 8 million people living in Israel right now, if you count diaspora people, let's give it generously 10 million people who can read Hebrew. And yet, if you walk into a bookstore in Tel Aviv, there's 100,000 books. And there's all kinds of new books coming out. There's author. It is a literary society.
Yeah, there are more writers, there are more serious writers in Israel than one can imagine. That list could have gone on for another 25 more. There are more books published. There are more, the book conventions there are very well attended in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv and probably in other cities as well. It's a society that really does, Jews like words. We like words. We use a lot of words. And we're a wordy society. And it is incredibly, the number of talented writers, like the number of talented artists and the number of talented dress designers and the number of brilliantly talented high-tech people is quite amazing for such a small country. It's mind-boggling for such a small country. There's a hell of a lot of talent squashed into a very small place.
So I want to take up the writer you didn't get to, who I think is the most...
David Grossman.
David Grossman. So David Grossman, his biography is amazing. and his politics. So let's take a moment and do that. Then you with some questions for.
Okay, I have.
Tell us
I
the
have an
biography
excerpt.
first, because the biography I think is worth knowing, right?
About his son dying, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Pull the mic close again. I'm sorry.
Okay, wait, I want to find the excerpt from David Grossman that I was going to read.
Yeah. You got it? I'll entertain you while she's looking.
Sing.
The Prime Minister is in Washington. Did you know that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And they had a press conference with the president today.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay, there.
so here's a list, just a list of the books this one man has written, right? Duel, The Smile of the Lamb, Sea Under Love, The Book of Intimate Grammar, The Zigzag Kid, Be My Knife, Someone to Run With, Her Body Knows, that's 2 novellas, To the End of the Land, Falling Out of Time, and then that was just the fiction, nonfiction. The Yellow Wind, Sleeping on a Wire, Conversations with Palestinians, Death as a Way of Life, Israel 10 Years After Oslo, Lion's Honey, The Myth of Samson, and Writing in the Dark, Essays on Literature and Politics. Films, Smile of the Lamb, Sun Run to Run With. He has won innumerable awards. He is politically left-wing and very cognizant of the issues, the deep issues Israel faces. Just, I think it was 2 months after, or 2 days, oh no, it was 2 days. And he, Amos Oz, and Abi Yehoshua held a press conference urging a ceasefire in the 2006 war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They urged a ceasefire. There was no ceasefire, and 2 days later, his own son was killed. He's been a social activist.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. But I was in Israel when this happened. The story is that this guy, everyone knew, he had a long history of being a political activist. And he's a ferocious left political activist, which means he wants to make peace with the Palestinians, makes peace with the Arabs, which earned a lot of ire from the Israeli right, basically. But even though that was his politics, his son was a soldier in the Israeli army.
And he was.
He had been a soldier.
Yeah, that's right.
And his son is a soldier. Now,
That's right.
we talk about paradoxes, contradictions, and disjunctions. The idea that the peacenik sends his kid to the army, and the peacenik is giving a demonstration against the war while his son is fighting in
That's
the
right.
war.
That's right.
And then what happens is the kid gets killed in action,
That's right.
and which was devastating to him and to his wife.
Yes.
And the story in Israel was how devastating this was to him and his wife. And he wasn't, but he fought his bitterness by continuing this political
That's right.
political voice. Go ahead. I'm sorry,
That's
I didn't mean
right.
to interrupt.
That's right. He's written, his books are extremely difficult. They're hard to get through, some of them. His nonfiction, The Yellow Wind, is a very, very important and quite beautiful and a book to read. His nonfiction is much more accessible than his fiction. The Book of Intimate Grammar is utterly difficult to get through. But I have some excerpts from you, if we have time.
Yeah.
After his son died, he wrote a book about a father who goes to find his dead child in the world of the dead. And he meets along the way others who are in deep mourning. The book is a combination of drama and poetry and myth. It's a deep, deep plunging into the depths of grief and what grief is about. Here's a brief excerpt from it. As they sit eating dinner, the man's face suddenly turns. He thrusts his plate away. Knives and forks clang. He stands up and seems not to know where he is. His gaze hovers around his wife without taking hold. "What happened?" she whispers with her eyes. "I have to go." "Where?" "To him." "Where?" "To him. There." "To the place where it happened?" No, there." "What do you mean, there?" "I don't know. You're scaring me." "Just to see him once more." "But what would you see now? What is left to see?" "I might be able to see him there, maybe even talk to him." "Talk? But what is there? There is no such place. There doesn't exist." "If you go there, it does. But you don't come back. No one ever has. Because only the dead have gone. And you? Where will you go?" "I will go there alive." "But you won't come back." "Maybe he's waiting for us." "He's not. It's been 5 years, and he's still not. He's not. Maybe he's wondering why we gave up on him so quickly, the minute they notified us." "Look at me. Look into my eyes. What are you doing to us? It's me. Can't you see? This is us, the two of us. This is our home. This is our kitchen. Come, sit down. I'll give you some soup. Stop." At night, people came bearing news. We opened the door, this one. We stood here, you and I, shoulder to shoulder. They on the threshold, and we facing them. And they mercifully, quietly stood there and gave us the breath of death. That's just a small sample of his profound probing of what it means to be a parent who lost a child.
Yeah.
And then he goes on with his political demonstrations. He goes on with such a profound commitment to trying to help Israel become the country that it could be at its best. And he never gives up.
Yeah. What's amazing about that particular passage, and it was published someplace, it was maybe in Haaretz, in Israel, in Yom HaZikaron, which is Memorial Day, it's the day before Yom HaTzmaut, everybody goes to the cemetery because everybody has a relative who died. And there's so many families. I went to go see a family that I'm close with. There's a kid that I taught when he was young who died in a helicopter crash on a military operation. And every family has this. There isn't a family that doesn't have a child, a nephew, a niece, a cousin, a brother, a sister who's lost. And so what he's doing is capturing every family in the country. And while not everybody agrees with his politics, everybody identifies with his description of the deep longing, of going to the cemetery, of not going to the cemetery, all the deep longing that's part of the Israeli culture. All right, we have a minute or two before we have to send Miriam back across the mighty Santa Monica's. Anyone have a question? It took her an hour and a half to get here, so we're afraid to send her home. Anyone have a question they want to ask? Yeah, we have a question. You don't have, tonight it's not like, you don't have to give opinion questions. Just anyone have a question they want to ask about literature or stuff that you've read or stuff that Miriam's read for us tonight that you'd like some more? Yeah, Mark.
It seems to me, after listening to you, that fiction is make-believe. And so I wonder, what is the importance of fiction? It's not relevant to reality. It doesn't change reality, but it's all in a person's mind.
Okay, good question. And without giving us all of Lit 1, right? In 3 sentences, give the answer.
So
That's
one
the
of
first
the
lecture
ancient,
in Literature 1, is the answer to that question. The truth of literature. Okay, but
one of the ancient statements about literature is that it holds a mirror up to nature, meaning our natures, meaning our lives. It is through the good books, the important fiction, that we see aspects of ourselves and of our world that we may be completely unaware of. A good writer takes you to the depths of life and your own being and human life and shows you what you don't even know is there.
thank you. Please.
So I have 2 very short things. The first one is Ephraim Kishon. You haven't mentioned him, and he sat next to me on a flight back to South Africa once.
I hope he kept you
And
laughing.
All he did was ask me, and I didn't know half of the answers, how many Jews lived in South Africa. And I went back and studied it all. He really wanted to know a lot, which opened my eyes to how much we don't know. And also, I want to know if there are any books written about the Mahabharata and that era in English.
Oh, Ronit, the one I talked about.
Was
First
she-
of all, I didn't mention Ephraim Kishon because this is literature since 2000.
Okay.
You know,
that's why.
this is only what's going on now.
Right.
And The Sound of Our Steps takes place in a Mahabharata.
But now, was she a baby? I mean,
No, she was a little girl.
because I was 14 when we were in the Mahabharata. So it's vivid. All right. Thank you.
But it's a very vivid description. It's very powerful.
It is. Thank you.
Very powerful.
What film? What film?
Oh, Salah Shabati.
Right. Now, Salah Shabati was one of the first great Israeli film, and Ephraim Kishon wrote the screenplay, and it's a comedy.
But
about
notice, wait a second, I'm not going to let you off the hook.
Isn't that true, though?
We laughed our heads off at Salah Shabati when we saw it,
Yeah.
forgetting they were making fun of a Mizrahi man. And that was okay in those days.
Yeah.
But we had no awareness, no critical awareness of what we were, a bunch of Ashkenazim laughing at a funny Mizrahi. So there's some racism in that we didn't realize. Nobody
Yeah, no, you're right,
realized.
you're right, you're right,
Nobody realized, but it's there.
right.
And I mean, it's a killer to know that because we all love that movie so much.
Yeah.
But
Jerry.
I just wanted to know whether there's room in contemporary Israeli literature for some other kinds of literature, a little icing on this nourishing cake. I just remember the time when we went to Budapest and our guide had lost his voice trying to herd some Americans the day before, and so we gave him the day off. And we said, just tell us where we should go. He said, well, go to the National Gallery. That's our national treasures. It was the most depressing day we ever
wow.
spent because the Hungarian concept of life made German painting look cheerful. So that they just have that as their national character. I would hate to see Israel develop in its literary character what Hungary developed in
not
its
at all.
visual.
I mean, there's great humor in Israel. I mean, the same issues that may tear you apart also make you laugh. There's funny programs on television. Sayed Kashua is funny. I mean, his Arab Labor was a funny program. There are humorous programs all the time. Of course, Israel is also the creator of the television series Homeland, on the other side. But, there's wonderful comedy. Perhaps novelists, not so much, although I must say Edgar Keret has his tongue in his cheek through most of his stories. And they see him as heralding that postmodern new generation. born, yesterday, the day before, hard to believe writers were born in 1970 or 80, even worse. 90. How can you be a writer and born in 1990? But there are.
Right. Okay. Anyone have the microphone? Well, let's thank you, Miriam Glazer, for
Okay.
schlepping over here. Thanks so much. And thank you. The reading list is so valuable, so thank you for the reading list. It's absolutely wonderful.